our program this evening. We have Laura here from the Museum of Russian Icons to tell us a little bit more about these lovely Russian dolls.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This is my favorite presentation to give. The dolls are just delightful, and I think so many people have connections to them. They've played with them, they've seen them, but they're a little bit of a mystery. Where do they come from? What do they mean? And it's an interesting history. So really, if you look at the idea of nested objects, you're going to go back into ancient Asian cultures, where the idea of nesting things you found in sacred relics like these nesting caskets. We also had nesting tables, various nesting decorative boxes. This was not a new concept, but the idea of using this nested concept with toys didn't happen until much later, and it didn't happen until the end of the 1800s in Japan. Now everybody thinks of Russia when they think of the nesting doll, because that's where the first ones really started to come out to the public. There was a small monastery in Japan that produced the very first dolls, and they were Asian in style. But there was a Russian monk living in the monastery at the time who may have had a hand in crafting this toy. And both Japan or Russia could maybe take ownership of the advent of the nesting doll. Either way, the Japanese dolls did go to Russia, where toy makers there started to copy the craft. Behind me here we have some nested kokeshi dolls. The kokeshi doll is a traditional doll in Japan, although it's not traditionally nested. And it's a long, straight doll with kind of a bobbly head. Another type of nesting doll that was made early on in Japan is a nesting samurai. These ones tend to be a little bit more clunky, maybe more adept for being played with, but they did have kind of a decorative purpose. But the first nesting dolls were made at a monastery in Russia that was already producing toys. Now we think of monasteries like we think of museums, like we think of libraries, schools, as entities that aren't out there to make money. These are not-for-profits. But of course, money is what makes the world go round, and everybody needs to make money to function. And monasteries, you hear about them crafting wines, beers, honey, wax candles in the Orthodox Church. They create icons to sell, but this monastery produced wooden carved toys. And these were for really the elite of Russia, the wealthy classes, and they specifically made toys for the children of the czars. The toy makers there were very much enchanted with this idea of nesting dolls. Now at this time in Russia, there was also a cultural shift. No longer looking to France and the rest of Europe for inspiration, they were looking back at their own people. So the noble classes, the people who had time for leisure, were looking at the everyday people. How are they dressing? What are they producing for art? And it's called the arts and crafts movement. And that's when the doll is made. And that's why instead of making a beautiful princess nesting doll, they've made the matryoshka, the mother doll. And the very first, you can see here behind me, was modeled after a Russian peasant woman. And there she is, she's holding a chicken, and inside are all of her children, and they're all holding different implements of farm work. That doll went to the World's Fair in Paris and was a phenomenon. People were enchanted, and it became the quintessential Russian souvenir. When you went to Russia, you came back with it all. And so much so that people forget that they weren't invented until the 1890s. They're a relatively new object, but they are so synonymous with Russian culture, especially the tourist trade. Now, after the revolution, everything shifts in Russia. Whereas before you had dedicated workshops in monasteries and towns producing small amounts of toys and other crafts for a very small purchasing class, the elite. You have the state creating these big factories not just to produce the dolls. They had factories in different regions producing tableware. They're producing artworks. They're producing different objects for the tourist trade, including these dolls. And the dolls are all hand-painted still, but they mandate specific styles, so a very set template for each factory. Now, one of the oldest factories is either Sergei Posad before and after the fall of the Soviet Union, or Zagorsk during the Soviet Union. And this is where the first dolls came out. And they're similar in style to those first dolls. A very simple face, very mother-like. She has the daughters and have sons inside of her, and often with flowers. Now, while this one is a perfect example, I want to point out the dolls at a glance are very complex. They have all these beautiful little details, and you think, what skill, what mastery went into creating this? But anybody can learn to make a doll. And if you look closely at the flowers on the mother doll, it's made of polka dots. And what they would do is they would dip the back of the paintbrush in the paint and then stamp it, creating beautiful polka dots. They add a few slashes with the regular part of the paintbrush, and then they have a beautiful bouquet of flowers that can be made very quickly and with very little skill. You see her beautiful red lips. That's made in much the same style. 3 polka dots with a black line through to make a smile. All those simple little, easy to make details put together create this beautiful piece. So anybody can get a blank nesting doll and paint it. The skill is in making the doll itself, which takes years to learn. It's turned on a lathe. It's like a big spindle. A block of wood goes on, and they slowly carve out each doll, starting from the smallest and getting to the largest, until they have a full set. And a person would apprentice with a woodsmith for 5 to 10 years before he really even got to start making dolls. The dolls could also be used to give specific messages, to teach stories, to say something important. Now, this early Soviet doll is making fun of the bourgeoisie, the wealthy class. So here you have a very rotund gentleman, and his waistcoat is streaming at the buttons, and inside him is a very ostentatious piece with a number of cups and caskets, plates and bowls. Here's a more contemporary doll from Zagorsk. You can see, even though they've developed a lot of new techniques, that simple design, that polka dot design, is still there. And then this is a very contemporary doll. They've used a wood burning technique, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's modeled after the original doll. The next biggest area of production, and actually this is not the oldest, but this is the largest area of production, and these are the dolls people most recognize, are the Semenov dolls. And these are the ones with big red roses on her apron or what she's holding, and then beautiful curly cues on her babushka, on her scarf. And now those look complicated, but what they would do is they would make a scroll, so they rolled up a piece of parchment, and then they would dip it in India ink and then stamp that curly cue all over her head. And you can see with this one, the inner dolls are still very shiny and bright and new looking because they were protected inside the mother doll. And so it can be a little bit difficult to date the dolls, especially if you're looking at the ones that were inside versus the one that's outside. This doll is called the Good Father in Winter, and it's just a little Russian family. He's all dressed up for the cold weather. Inside is a more typical Semenov doll, and then you have what are called the lad and lass shapes, so the young boy and the young girl. What's interesting is at this time, when this doll was created, this was the Cold War, and so in every aspect of kind of propaganda, at every type of culture they would find some little bits of propaganda, and they would point to the dolls and they would say, we're using these dolls to teach our children about families. They're learning about counting. They're learning about spatial recognition, how the dolls fit in each other, and look at American children playing with Barbies, learning consumerism. So they're very proud of their dolls. It's the perfect Soviet toy. And this doll tells a fairy tale. And it's one of my favorites. There was an elderly couple who had no children. And they always wished for a daughter who would love them and cherish them. And they were woodsmen. And so they'd go out and they'd chop wood and sell the wood at the market. And one day they took a break and they made a little girl out of snow. And they stopped being grown-ups for a bit and they just pretended that they had this little snow daughter. And Morozko, the god of winter, also known as Grandfather Frost, saw this from his winds and was delighted. And so he breathed life into the girl, and she came to life, and she was a wonderful, beautiful daughter, taking care of her parents. Was always told, don't go into the summer. And she did that for many, many years. And then one day, she's traipsing through the woods to go to the market, and in the sunny field, there was a young man playing the lute, and she fell in love immediately, and she ran out to say hello to him and then melted into a puddle. But Morozko came back and he whisked her away up north where she could live in the snowy lands forever. And of course the dolls weren't just for girls, they had warriors, soldier dolls. These are modeled after the Kievan soldiers with their very pointed hats. And they're not unlike Vikings. And there is a lot of ancient cultural trading between the Nordic world, where we see the Vikings, and the Slavic world, where we see Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, so on and so forth. Next area is Kirov. These dolls look very similar to the Semenov dolls. In fact, they often have the same curlicue, but they have red hair. And this is because this is a more southern region in Russia. And the dolls were also supposed to reflect the community around them. And so girls were more fair-haired, and so they made the dolls more fair-haired. Kirov was also one of the bigger areas producing rye, which is a type of wheat. And this was celebrated in the dolls. So again, there's a little bit of propaganda of saying, look how great and glorious our rye fields are. We can cut up the straw and use it in our art. This is an older tradition, but they started doing it in the dolls. And they would cut the rye straw into geometrical shapes and then put it on, glue them onto the dolls. And they're quite beautiful, but incredibly fragile, because as that top lacquer layer, the clay layer that protects it, wears down with clay, especially if it's left in the sun, the rye straw starts to peel off. Not far from Kirov is Kivinin. Again, these dolls tend to be fair-haired. They even have blue eyes, very different. And this area, this region, was one of the few areas where wood burning was first used. And people had already been burning wood as a craft, as a trade prior to this, and so it was a natural fit. And so they would burn these very simple geometric designs into the dolls and then paint over them. It's quite beautiful. Early artists using this technique would have small sharp rods placed in a flame until it was hot enough. But nowadays, and actually throughout the Soviet Union, they'd have electric tools. Growing sophistication. Some of the dolls are so textured it looks like almost like a real beard, like you could run your fingers through. And when you hold this doll, you actually can feel all the texture, and it's quite delightful. He's another Kievan soldier. He's very Viking-like, ready to go off into battle. This doll, this isn't a nesting doll, but I love this doll because she's doing something very unique to Slavic culture. Now, in many Slavic cultures, whenever there's a grand event, a wedding, a funeral, any big celebration, sometimes even so simple as a guest coming over to your house for dinner, there's a ceremony. It's the presentation of the bread and salt. And they use a special type of bread, and it's woven in such a way that there's a little well on top where a little bowl is placed. and that's filled with salt. And so the guest of honor, whoever is the most important at the event, will break off a little bread, dip it in salt, and then consume it. And this is an ancient ceremony, but it's played out in the dolls, and it's very, very sweet. Yoshikar Ola produces the most fragile dolls. These ones are turned so expertly, the wood is very, very thin, that many, many dolls can fit inside the mother doll. But the mother dolls aren't necessarily that tall. This one is about 8 inches tall. You can see how many dolls all fit inside. The painting tends to be much simpler. It's big blocks of color and simple geometric shapes. Moldova was one of the few regions that produced mostly male dolls. So here they have some woodsmen. These tend to be much more hard-wearing. These were designed solely for toys. They weren't necessarily decorative. And Belarus had the greatest variety of dolls and the most whimsical. They had a very simple shape, a very thick turned wood, so they could be thrown, smashed, you could let a toddler play with them, and no harm would come to them. But the artists were given a lot of leeway in the style of painting. And so this one is a nested family with the father on top. But you would have clowns, you'd have characters from fairy tales, such as the Fairy Maiden. You'd have my very favorite doll in our collection, is Papa Igor. He looks utterly overwhelmed holding his twin babies. And then the cosmonaut dolls. So this is another instance of propaganda, or maybe just a celebration of culture seeping into these dolls. Part of the Cold War was the space race. And now we have a lot of nostalgia around it. Isn't it so wonderful? Isn't it so great? But at the time, there was a lot of tension between the United States government and the Russian government of who's going to get to the moon first, who's going to win the space race. And at every leg of the journey, Russia got there first. They were the first to get a satellite up there. They were first to get animals up there. They were first to get a man up into orbit. And they would have been first to the moon except for a glitch in their systems. There was a malfunction and they had to abandon the mission. So we won the space race in the end. But for a time, the biggest celebration, parades were held, songs were written, shows were developed, everything was centered around the space race in both sides of the culture. And so the cosmonaut dolls became very popular. Polkov is another region. These dolls tend to be even simpler in style. They have tall, slender bodies, and they only use a few colors, typically. Reds, naked wood, yellows, and then black. Polkov was already a region that was producing small cloak crafts and toys for children. This penny whistle comes from there. And rather than having large factories, there were small workshops throughout the village where families would run. Typically, the men and the boys would do all the carving, the whittling, and then with the dolls, the turning, and the women and the girls would do all of the painting. And so families would produce this as a way of us making money to support the family. This is a little lass and lad. These ones are less folksy. This is more of a princess girl. She's got a beautiful fur muff with her to warm her hands. He has a beautiful blue one. They're very sweet. Now, some of the countries, some of the regions I'm talking about are NAFTA countries. Ukraine's been in the news. They produced, I think, the most beautiful dolls. They tended to be very much like other Ukrainian crafts, very complex geometric designs. Now the skill that goes into painting is quite incredible. This doll is called the peace doll, and it starts with that same bread and salt ritual, where bread and salt ritual is much more prevalent in Ukraine than it is in some other Slavic countries. And you can actually see different members of state from our country who have visited Ukraine, including when he was Vice President, President Biden. participating in the burning salt ritual. So it shows you how prevalent it is even in today's culture. The second doll in holds a dove and then flowers. So these dolls are meant to be a message of peace. Ukrainian artists also really played with shapes. Instead of just doing one generic shape, they had a number. The first one I showed you was kind of a bullet shape. These ones are very conical, they're very interesting, and they have these male and female sets together, which are really fun. The male set are musicians. And they're wearing clothes that are very the folk costumes of Ukraine. Poland kind of jumped on the nesting doll bandwagon, and you'll find a lot of people who are Polish descent, they'll call them babushka dolls. It's very similar to the name Matryoshka, they're grandmother dolls, and they follow the same line. These dolls, by the way, are just about 1.5 inches tall. They're very small. They fit all those little dolls inside. There was a period of time in Poland where all the women were wearing these Zakopane suits, these striped suits. They were very fashionable, and dolls were made to reflect that. Poland also played around with dolls as storytelling devices. This is the 3 little pigs. And then it spread further. Other countries were looking into it. Can we create our own nesting dolls? India actually petitioned Russia for aid in this, and many Russian officials went to India and helped them establish factories, and they started creating dolls, mostly for export, but there were dolls made that were made to reflect Indian culture, such as this one, which is the Happy Family. We have 2 of these types. I only have a nice photo of this one. I wish I had a nice photo of the other one because he has a bobblehead. He's very sweet. China started producing dolls as well. Almost all of the dolls produced in China were produced to sell to American retailers, so they featured recognizable topics for America. And so this is the greatest show on earth, which maybe is not so recognizable this day and age. It is becoming less and less prevalent, but this is the circus with the performing elephant, the clown, strong man, so on and so forth. After the fall of the Soviet Union, these state-run factories shut down, and state-run factories across the board shut down towards the end of the 1980s and then into the 1990s. And people were desperate for money. And many artists started taking blanks home, or they started setting up small workshops. And no longer are they following these state-mandated designs, but they're creating dolls from their own artistry. They're being creative and they're having fun with it, and they're selling them off to Western collectors. And so the 1990s is really what we call the golden age of the Matryoshka doll. This one celebrates Russian folk life. You have all sorts of things you would find on a typical Russian peasant table. You find different fruits and vegetables. You find the samovar, which is part of the Russian tea ceremony. Cakes, a lovely bottle of vodka being held by the young boy there. And then the girls holding a little circle cookie that they typically serve with tea. It's a very hard-baked cracker. You're meant to dunk it in your tea until it's soft. But they would give it to small children to tea them. This doll celebrates Russian winter. All the wonderful, fun, exciting things that happen, making snowmen, sledding, all this joyous. But each doll includes a bird. And that is a very interesting part of Russian culture that I think very much connects to our culture. So you're in the dead of winter, Christmas has come and gone. It's February, it's March, you're really hoping for spring, you're sick of the slushy snow, the grayness, and what are we all watching out for? We're watching out for the robin. And when the robin comes, everybody goes, so I've seen a robin, spring is coming, spring is coming. We've done it, we've made it through another year. Now in Russia, it's the lark. The lark comes back and people say the same thing, I've seen the lark, I've seen the lark. So the larks have returned. We've made it through another winter. This doll celebrates Russian architecture. I just want to point out how the artists are now really sculpting the faces. They're making big, beautiful eyes. They're actually shading, creating a more rounded form. And they're really beautiful works of art. This doll celebrates different types of folk costumes throughout Russia. And this doll tells a really beautiful children's story, folk story, that you find in many different forms throughout Russia, different Slavic countries, and then in slightly altered forms now. You're finding different children's authors are coming across this and adding their own iteration. But essentially, grandfather goes out to the garden to pull a turnip for dinner, and he pulls and he tugs and he can't get it up. So he calls his wife, the grandmother. She pulls him, he pulls the turnip, it won't come up. So they call the granddaughter, and then the dog, the cat, and finally the mouse. And the mouse comes up and he goes, well, I'm big and mighty and strong, and I can pull that turnip up. And the mouse pulls the cat, he pulls the dog, he pulls the granddaughter, he pulls the grandmother, he pulls the grandfather, and then they pull up a turnip as big as a house, and they all have a feast. And the moral of this story is that the mouse, being the smallest and the weakest of the group, is the one that was the final piece they needed. So working together as a group, they were all able. So everybody from the mighty grandfather to the Minnie Mouse were important. And equally so, which is a very Soviet ideal, but I think still important today. More recognizable, you have St. George slaying the dragon and saving the princess. These dragons have little bobbleheads. This one tells the story of a magic fish. There are many magic fish in Russian tales. In this one, a very lazy boy is sent out to fish, and he finds this happened fish, and the fish says, well, if you let me go, I'll grant you one wish. And he wishes to never have to work a day of his life. And then through a series of misadventures, wherein he refuses to work, somehow all these magical things happen. He marries the Tsarina, the princess, and becomes a prince, and gets to spend the rest of his days loafing about by the fireplace. With the fall of the Soviet Union came a resurgence not just of freedom of expression with artists, but also a new freedom of religion. Religion had been suppressed. Not specifically outlawed, but if you were a member of any type of religion, you couldn't be a member of the Communist Party, and you risked arrest, fines, just for practicing your religion. And there was a huge resurgence showing that people hadn't really forsaken their faith. They kept their faith even in secret. And this is reflected in the dolls. One of the common themes in dolls after the fall of the Soviet Union was these religious dolls. This one is carved into the wood, and then the uncarved portions are dyed black to give this kind of ebony and ivory feel. This is a series of nesting dolls, and they're holding icons. And then the political dolls, which became very popular, especially with all of the Western tourists, which there was a huge influx in the 1990s. So people finally now can go visit this very strange country that our country has been at odds with and find out all about it. And so stalls up and down the streets would be lined and filled with these different political dolls. And with each new leader, a new style would be done. This one is backwards. Instead of starting with Lenin and working their way up. The smallest being Lenin. This one, the biggest one, is Lenin. Oftentimes they're caricatures. They're like political cartoons on the dolls. And I'm going to end my talk with this one. So I mentioned a couple times about dolls being used for political purposes, and then of course the political dolls. This doll was made in 2004 in Ukraine. And if you kind of pay attention to the caricatures, these are made to look like evil villains. Very much the villain trope, especially Putin, who's wearing these white kid gloves. He's got that comical big tie, and he's holding a document, and KGB has been crossed out. Saying, well, you were KGB, and now you're saying that you're not KGB, but clearly you've not, forsaken this. And I think it highlights, Ukraine really entered the common sphere of news in 2014 with the Maidan riots. but this conflict has been going on for quite some time. And the artist of this doll highlighted it. And actually highlighted how each ruler, going very far back, was harmful to Ukraine. And that ends that portion of the presentation. I'm here if anybody has any questions, and I have brought in an assortment of dolls. You can come up and play with them, open them, look at them. You'll see a lot of them match the styles that I talked about during my talk. And again, if you have any questions at all, I'm happy to go back to other slides and explore things further.
How long did it take for them to make the set?
So, in actuality, you would have to dry the wood for 3 years. But once you get that, the turning was pretty quick. A master turner would turn out hundreds of dolls a day. You can actually see videos where they turn them very, very fast because they're very skilled at it. The painting itself, because they did it assembly line style, one person would be doing the polka dots on the apron, one person would be doing that. The best painter in the line would be doing all the faces. So they were producing, the factory is producing thousands of dolls. And that's why they're so prevalent and so affordable. But the artist dolls would take much longer. Any other questions? You want to come up?
What got you interested in this, and then where did you get all your dolls?
Well, I've had an interest in these dolls since I was a little girl. I never played with them at my grandfather's house. But the museum became interested. We received a gift of these in 2013. We were given almost 300 nesting dolls. The woman who collected them, she fell in love with them, and she collected them as a way of self-growth. She was going through a sickness, lupus, and she coped by collecting these dolls and building really an encyclopedic collection. She gave it to us, and we're able to use it to teach the history of it.
Thank you.
We have free passes to come to the museum. We don't have any dolls on display, but we do have our icons up, and right now we have a beautiful display of ballet photography.